Welcome to Chapter 2. This video will cover the first learning objective in Chapter 2, Methodology, How Social Psychologists Do Research, for PSY 235, Social Psychology. Our first learning objective in this chapter refers to describing how researchers develop hypotheses and theories. So we'll start out by acknowledging, like all of psychology, which is a scientific endeavor, social psychology is an empirical science, meaning that what we do as scientists is to study the phenomenon of interest, in this case social influence, to study it scientifically, meaning that we don't just go with what we feel seems obvious or to be something that everybody already knows based on our own experiences. We actually have to test those assumptions to know whether or not they have validity in the real world. So there are lots of experiences that we have. For example, that we feel like we know what other people are like. We understand what their motives are. We can determine their motives based on very flimsy information. Are we really that accurate? And what you'll find as you continue to study in this class is that human beings are really pretty hit or miss in terms of their ability to figure out why other people do what they do, and even to understand why they themselves do what they do. So we need to look at social behavior and social influence with a critical scientific eye in order to test our assumptions. And this helps us to avoid something called hindsight bias, which is the tendency to really feel like we knew what an outcome was going to be after it's happened. This is part of, our human social tendency to want to feel like we're in more control and to feel like we have a better understanding of what's going on around us. And that includes our interpretations of other people's behavior, as well as our inferences about the causes of our own behavior. So you're probably familiar with the basics of the scientific method. Either, you've been in science classes since you were in elementary school, so I'm sure that you've been exposed to these basics. But a quick review: what we do as scientists is we come up with a problem that we usually state as a question, as a research question. And then we have to formulate predictions based on theory, based on previous research, for what we expect to find as the answer to that question. Then you have to design a study. It may be an experiment, it may be a quasi-experiment, it may be a correlational study, it may use one of 100 different techniques, but you have to design it so that those hypotheses can be tested. Then you actually go out and collect the data, then you analyze the data, and based on that data analysis, you can draw a conclusion as to whether or not the data you collected actually supports your hypotheses. If it doesn't, then you kind of go back to the drawing board and reassess your theories, your assumptions. You take a hard look at the previous literature and make some decisions about maybe there were design flaws in the experiment, maybe there were problems with the interpretation. And what usually happens is you redesign the study, go back and do it again. So a lot of the scientific process is very iterative. You start with a small study, you then kind of get proof of concept evidence for your hypotheses, then you do a bigger study, maybe apply it to new circumstances, and that helps to drive the science forward. So this iterative nature, once you get results, you can go back and revisit theories. There have been many cases in psychology as well as other sciences where early theories, they may be supported by the evidence available at the time, but later new evidence comes to light, new studies are done, maybe new technologies emerge, and you find that the theory no longer has the same kind of explanatory power. And if that's the case, then you have to retool the theory, address the theory, adjust it, in some cases toss the theory out entirely, depending on the data that you have. And also, since we're studying people, humans, especially in a social context, continue to change all the time. Think about the rapid transformation that the advent of the internet and now the onset of AI, what kind of transformations is that having for human beings and for human social interaction? So we're going to see a lot of new theories popping up. We're going to see some old theories needing to be adjusted to make sense of our current situation. So we may be asked to formulate and test new hypotheses based on where we are right now. Where do hypotheses come from? Typically, we want to ground our new questions and our new predictions in previous research, and it may also be grounded in previous theories. I would be lying if I would say that there's never been a time where personal observations did not also trigger hypotheses, and it's perfectly appropriate to do that. So, for example, I've been a long-time volunteer for a Labrador Retriever dog rescue, and I took in foster dogs for them. And over the years of doing that, because it's a hard job, I was very curious about the experiences of volunteers who foster dogs. And I went into the research literature and I found there was pretty much nothing had been done. Nobody was even asking this question about what are the impacts of fostering dogs on the emotional well-being of these volunteers. So I had to kind of take a sidestep and say, okay, what do we know about people who foster people? What do we know about caregivers in other contexts? And I found some research there. So it was both my personal observations and digging into the previous literature, although it was in a different area, to help me design a qualitative study to look into that question. So formulating hypotheses and theories, generally speaking, we like to keep our research programs connected to existing theories and explanations. Sometimes that's not possible. If you're charting a brand new area of research, there may be very little to go on in the past. You may also be setting the stage for arguing that an existing theory is not sufficient for explaining the experiences that people are having right now. So you may be dissatisfied with the current theories. You may want to add additional new variables to what's going on. I saw a lot of this happening in the social influence area as the internet grew exponentially, and now as we're adding AI to the mix, there are brand new variables that really need to be taken into account as we study things like persuasion and attribution. Researchers also may want to test out and explore tweaking methodologies. So an example here in advertising research, which is really connected to social psychology strongly, when eye tracking software was invented, that was kind of a game changer because you could literally look and measure where people's eyes went on a document or on a screen. Now we have virtual reality, and many of those virtual reality headsets can do the same kinds of things and are set up so that data can be collected using them. So I'm starting to see in the persuasion literature, in the advertising literature, some researchers are really testing out how do we use VR technology to understand better how it is that people are responding to media of various kinds. So the bottom line is theories are always being tested, they're always being refined. Rarely are they completely tossed out, but it does happen. So science, it's one of those things where you're never going to be finished with establishing an absolutely irrefutable fact. Human beings are messy, they're complicated, we continue to change with time. Some things are pretty steadfast, like we tend to like things that we're more familiar with. I don't see that changing anytime soon. So that theory is probably going to stick for the long haul. But there are lots of things about our world that are continuously changing. Therefore, we have to always be, as scientists, open to new methodologies, open to new questions, and to challenges of our existing theories. When we base our research on personal observations, like I was telling you about my research with foster providers for dog rescues, we do have personal experiences or observations that can help us to build our research ideas. Sometimes it's a current experience. I have lots of colleagues who study the science of teaching and learning. So they will take their current experiences with students like you, and they may have questions, maybe about a new application or a new technique that they're trying in the classroom, a new model, and they want to test it out. So that may be really strongly grounded in their current experiences. There could be new phenomena that are emerging in the culture. So, for example, social media and things like AI are relatively new social phenomenon that are getting a lot of research attention at the present time. There may also be questions that we have about current social problems. As we move through the course, you'll see that a lot of the early research, especially when we get into things like social influence in the form of obedience, compliance, and conformity, and when we get to the very end of the semester, the study of prejudice, a lot of the early social psychology research was conducted by people who had experience with the real horrors of prejudice, particularly in the form of the Holocaust. So in early social psychology, you had a lot of people who were in the sciences, who were studying whatever it was they were studying at the time, but many of them were Jewish. Not all of them, because the Nazi regime also went after intellectuals just as a general rule. So many of them found themselves, chased out of Germany, out of Central Europe, off to the West. Many of them landed in the United States, and they became, really interested in prejudice directly because of their own and their own families' experiences of living through the World War II experience. What you'll find as we move forward, and this is the last slide for this learning objective, what you'll find as we move forward is that for social psychology in particular, it's usually a mix of building research programs based on existing theories and explanations, and then pursuing things that are of personal, passionate interest to you as a researcher. And both of those are equally valid. But I will say that if you're driven by your own particular experience, like I was with my research on fostering dogs in rescues, I was particularly interested in volunteerism, and I had to ground the research that I was doing in whatever theory was existing and available. So I really tapped into those older theories and explanations, put that on top of my current experiences, and then moved forward with my research plan. In the next video, we'll be looking at Learning Objective 2.2, looking at strengths and weaknesses of various specific methodologies.